Grief is the experience of loss, and loss impacts us mentally, emotionally, physically. It can impact us socially, culturally, and spiritually. We also live in a culture just on this side of the world where we don't do a great job of grieving. We spend a lot of energy trying to avoid pain. In doing that, we avoid pain, and so then oftentimes we get blindsided by loss, and so we don't always know what grieving should look like. And so I think it's good to look to God's word to see what should this look like for us. And even in the church, we struggle with it as well. A lot of times in the church, we are focused on so many other things that we don't really give space for sorrow,
Yeah.
and I think the reason for that often is the fear of despair and wallowing in sorrow, and of course that isn't helpful either. But we do want to be able to work through it in a way, God's way. So working through grief God's way. And my working definition of grieving is the process of acknowledging what's true. And, in a counseling setting, or a pastor or a leader of someone who's helping someone through a loss, our role is to join them in their loss and to identify what is true and what's not true. Because that's one of the things that's really difficult about loss is we often end up believing a lot of things about that event or what it means about us that actually derails us from what God says is true about who we are, where he has us in the mission.
Yeah.
And so that kind of is our position, is to help people work through what it is for them and what it isn't for them, and according to what God's word says about them.
So when we're talking about grief and we're talking about loss, that could be lots of different things for different people in different circumstances. So I think like on one end, someone may lose their job that they had for a long time. It was a part of their identity. They were very attached to what they did. Maybe they were passionate about what they did, and they lose that job. And suddenly they enter a period of grief, and they have to figure out how to navigate all those emotions and work through them before the Lord. And it could be as extreme as someone losing a loved one or a friend tragically. And so it runs the gamut. Maybe walk us through different examples or common examples of how someone might face grief.
Yeah, like you're saying, so as we grieve, it kind of moves into a spectrum, so loss isn't created equally. There's lots of different types of loss, and yet it's significant for us to work through all the losses that we do go through. Sometimes we when we have a loss that we don't necessarily think is significant, we might not even notice it, or we might minimize it or dismiss it.
Right.
But it's important for us to work through it because it allows us to practice moving through pain and working through it in a biblical way. And so, you might go through something horrific like, a diagnosis, or you might be going through a divorce in your family, or experiencing a loss of a loved one, or something as insignificant as it could seem to be dismissed by a friend, or an expectation not being met, and anything in between. There's all kinds of different things, like you said, like losing your job, or a house fire, or something that happened to my wife and I, or happened to me, I guess. A few years back, I dropped the hard drive that our wedding video was on, and man, it's like that stunk, man. It's like every year when our wedding anniversary comes along, I think about that. And the first year I felt sick.
I
was
remember.
like, oh, God. I was like, can't believe this. And you were like, well, we got married and there wasn't even video footage of it, right? But so it's like, it's relative, but for us, it was a loss. And then, little things like you think about my boys, I'm like, man, it'd be cool to show them that video. So being able to work through that biblically is important, regardless of how extreme it is.
Sure. Yeah. When we ignore loss, what are the dangers associated with just ignoring it, shoving it under the rug, or moving on in life as though that pain didn't enter in? I mean, what's the danger of doing that?
At first, it's helpful, right? You're living your life, and pain is disruptive, and so that's typically why we do it. So I can find a way to not feel that pain. And when I do that, I feel some relief or some escape. But just like ignoring any type of pain or problem or dysfunction, when we do that, it's helpful in the moment, but long term it creates more problems. Mm-hmm. So, emotionally we can go septic. If you repress pain long enough, then when life squeezes you, it will come out at times when you're not ready for it. A picture that I think of often when I think of this idea, when I was 18, I was riding my bike. I got hit by a car. I went through the window. Mm-hmm. You remember this? Yeah. A long story short, they sewed my hand up. They'd taken a lot of the glass out of it. But over the course of the next 6 months to a year, every now and then, if I picked up something heavy, I would feel this sharp pain in my hand. And so I'd see this little, you can see the scar right there, but I would feel this little, speck there, and I would have to scratch at it. It was painful, right? To work that little piece of glass out.
Yeah, glass was surfacing.
It was, my body was pushing it out. And when I felt, when I picked up something heavy, I felt that pain. And so that's the same thing with, loss or any type of emotional pain. If we don't address it, when life squeezes us, or if we pick up something heavy, we feel that pain surface then, whereas we maybe thought we had dealt with it by repressing it.
Yeah, and I think some ways that you see that manifest, sometimes people will suddenly and unexpectedly fall into deep depression. Mm-hmm. And they can't explain exactly where it's coming from.
Yeah. What is this? My life is fine, yet I don't feel fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Or it might, in some cases, look like, we don't like this word, but it's a legit word to explain what we're talking about. Someone else's loss might trigger some pain that they didn't expect. And so then they find themselves falling prey to the pain that they didn't address through the experience of another person. Yeah. And now they have to relive it and deal with it in a way that is afresh. So
that pain from the past is, I think of it being like poked in the present. You have like this emotional sunburn, so somebody else is going through something, or something hits you in life, and it reminds you, or reminds even your body, like there's this remembrance of it, and all of that pain that you had dissociated from is now surging into the foreground of your life, and it's incredibly disruptive. And really, it leads to us developing habits to cope that really distract us from, God getting glory from our life, us having real peace and joy, and distractions in all kinds of ways. So
maybe talk to us a little bit about why we grieve. Like, why is that built into us? Why has God given us kind of that emotional whiteboard, to work on and to work through our issues? Why is grieving important? And what does it look like often? Maybe just in our flesh, in a carnal sense. What does it look like, and how does it manifest itself when we're grieving through something?
We grieve because God designed us to. We live in a world that is obviously broken and disheveled, and so God designed us to be in right relationship with Him. And the brokenness of our world, so the pain, the anguish of our world is not righteous, right? And so it separates us from Him. And so when we grieve, it is us moving towards Him. And that's why I describe it as acknowledging what's true, So it's this process of identifying where I'm at in contrast to where truth is at. So God, we grieve because we need to be with the Father. I think of when I think of the process of grief, I think of like a natural disaster. So, at some point in your life, that storm is going to be on your front porch. When you hear the sirens go off, or maybe you don't, and you're blindsided by the storm, and your house is on the path of that tornado or whatever, and you get hit by hardship and a trial or tribulation. It's like, and it decimates your world, and so you climb out of the rubble of whatever just hit you, and you're standing on the wreckage of this disaster, and so there's a lot that happens to a person in that moment, right? And there's clinical frameworks for this. There's 5 steps to working through grief, and I think some of those are flawed or limited, mostly in acknowledging the fact that grief is unique and nonlinear. In fact, a lot of times we think we need to grieve, have a season of grief. And in reality, we need to allow grief to be seasonal in our life, meaning that it's okay for us to acknowledge what's true as we move through the hardships of life. It would be reasonable to grieve a loss on the milestones developmentally as you go through something.